So having studied about Renaissance, now we'll be talking about Reformation, which was a religious movement of 16th century. It was a movement against the corrupt practices that were emerging in the churches. It was a challenge to the authority of the Pope. With the age of reasoning coming and rationality becoming the major point, people started to question certain practices of the church and demanded explanations for that, for the corruption that was creeping in. The clergymen, they were indulging in a luxurious life. There were many corrupt practices that were coming up, which people began to question, and eventually it led to the reform of the churches. So this is the Reformation movement. It eventually led to the reform of the Roman Catholic Church and the split of the Roman Catholic Church into two parts, into two divisions. One was the Catholics, the other was the Protestants. So there were two churches emerging now, the Roman Catholic churches and the Protestant churches, giving rise to Protestantism. The spirit of inquiry, wherein rationality became the major point, reasoning was given major importance rather than superstition and simply accepting the traditional rituals. People gave importance to rationality now. The growing corruption in the church, where clergymen were enjoying luxurious life and indulging in many corrupt practices, and with the increasing power of the European kings, who were now not ready to accept the authority of the churches or the Pope over them, these were certain factors that became the reason that led to the Reformation, undermining the authority of the Pope and the churches and bringing in reform in the churches. The protest by Martin Luther, who was a German theologist who studied religion, a professor, he started the protest against the corrupt practices and challenged the authority of the Pope, and this became the immediate cause which eventually led to the Reformation movement. Martin Luther, who was he? He was the first religious reformer. He's the one who started the Reformation movement. He raised his voice against the malpractices of the clergy, the people who worked in the churches, and challenged the authority of the Pope, the highest authority, religious authority. He openly criticized the sale of indulgence. Now, what were indulgences? Indulgences were certificates that were granted as a remittance for any sin that a person has committed. That is to say, suppose a person committed a sin, he would go to the church and confess that. So in return of that, he was supposed to perform, so he was given certain punishment or penance that he had to perform so as to get rid of the guilt or the sin that he had committed. So he would perform the punishment. After that, he would be granted this certificate of indulgence that sent that he is now remitted of the sin that he committed because of his remorse and guilt. He has performed the penance and the punishment, so he is now done away with the sin that he has committed. But eventually this practice became corrupt. They started this practice of selling of indulgences. The church officials, the clergymen, they started to sell these indulgence certificates. People would just simply give money and buy these indulgences. Instead of going through the penance or the punishment, they would simply give money and buy these indulgence certificates. So it was favoring the rich people who would simply give the money and take these indulgence certificates and get away without doing any punishment or going through the penance. So this corrupt practice was widely criticized, and it was highly criticized by Martin Luther, who brought it into focus of the people, and it became the cause how the Reformation immediately started. As for Martin Luther, he believed in true devotion to God, and he was against the display of these ceremonies and rituals to reach God. So we see that Reformation movement was basically against the corrupt practices like the luxury life of the clergyman that they were indulging in, or the sale of indulgences. Such practices, it was against that. It made people not to accept blindly the authority of the churches, not to accept blindly the traditional system, the rituals, but to question, seek rationality into things, and this is what led to the reform of the churches. The churches eventually began to reform and bring about changes to gain the faith of the people. So it led to the reform of the churches, hence it is the Reformation movement. Major thing, it led into the split of two churches, the Protestants and the Catholics. This is the picture of Martin Luther. You can have a good look at it. Talking about now voyages and the discoveries, many new voyages were undertaken during this period. We see that kings and queens of different regions, they wanted to send explorers to far off regions to discover new routes, to discover new places where that would enhance the prestige of the empire, would lead to trade contacts, colonize those areas. So it would greatly benefit them. So this was age of exploration, We see that Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Dias, they were Portuguese sailors. Bartholomew, he reached the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. He found out this route which reached the southern tip of Africa. Vasco da Gama, he explored further. He reached till Calicut and he discovered the new sea route to India. As for Christopher Columbus, he was an Italian sailor who was financed by Spanish Queen Isabella. He wanted to discover the new route to east. He thought going west, further eventually west of west, it would eventually make him reach to the east. He ended up reaching West Indies and discovering the America in 1492, the New World. As for Ferdinand Magellan, he was a Portuguese navigator. His ship Victoria completed the voyage around the world. So it's credited with having circumnavigating the entire world. So these are the voyages and discoveries that took place during this time. You can have a look at the pictures of Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan, Christopher Columbus, and Bartholomew Dias.